It's 5 o'clock in London, it's midday in New York, midnight in Hong Kong, 2 a.m. in Sydney, 9 a.m. in San Francisco, and 9:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID Livestream, Series 25, Episode number 6. That means we're going to end our season ahead of a month off for summer at episode number 150 starts here. Well, widely anticipated, Thoma Bravo have been selling Nasdaq stock, leaving the Bursa Dubai once again the largest shareholder after two mega block deals have been absorbed by the market in a matter of months. Meanwhile, talking about absorption into the market, it's been a big month for departures from the Intercontinental Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange. An amazing trio of departures. First, Chief Marketing Officer Stephanie Dobbs-Brown declared with mission accomplished on her mega rebrand. Then New York Stock Exchange Vice Chairman John Tuttle announced a return to his Midwestern roots to become president of reinsurance titan Acrisure. Now comes news that it's a fond farewell to the excellent Josh King, who the post-New York Stock Exchange deal ICE Global Comms team owes its presence to, thanks to his huge work in reorganizing. Josh's brilliant Inside the Ice House podcast is going to have as its final guest under his suzerainty none other than Mr. Ice, Jeff Sprecher himself this week for what ought to be another magnificent show. And let me see, it was absolutely my pleasure to be, what was I guess, number 178 on that show, if I recall correctly. Then plaudits to the parish of exchanges, barring, it has to be said, the London Stock Exchange Group, on what was a pretty much perfect performance, despite the efforts of CrowdStrike and Microsoft, who've both been having their moments recently. Then again, I have to say, does anybody really feel more comfortable that regulators have really got the balance of risk and proportion right when we look at the miasma of prescription in the European Union's DORA, that's the Digital Operators Resilience Act? Gosh, maybe there's a cycle in regulation. That brings us elegantly, ladies and gentlemen, to our guest today, our returning guest, Dr. Richard Smith. The topic today, cycles, the mysterious forces that trigger events. Dr. Richard Smith is a fintech entrepreneur, a Berkeley Mathematician and PhD in systems science. He's CEO of the Foundation of the Study of Cycles and known as the Doctor of Uncertainty amongst his academic peers, who have helped government agencies and Fortune 500 companies, including Pfizer and Johnson Johnson, alike make sense of complex sets of data. I could go on and on. I could also add the fact that Dr. Smith has been a previous guest in our show, which was a magnificent event in and of itself. Richard, welcome back. It's lovely to see you. Where in the world are you today?
Oh, thank you, Patrick. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I am hiding out in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Southwest Virginia.
How magnificent. Good grief. It almost sounds like there could be a song about it, Richard. That's a wonderful place to be.
Denver just come to mind.
It's magnificent. So I'm not sure it's John Denver, possibly Laurel and Hardy hitting each other on the head with bottles, which I remember from childhood, which released the self-same song magnificently as well.
I'll let that one go.
Oh, there you go. It's a comedy moment. It lives with you from childhood. You see a bit of slapstick from Hollywood. You never forget it when you're 3 or 4. So tell me, I mean, you're back. We're back in this wonderful world where cycles are as ever important as ever. Albeit it has to be said, I'm not too sure that people have really noticed just how important cycles are. And actually, I mean, let's get to part of the nub of the effort. You've just published the seminal work, I think, in many ways, on cycles. Tell us a little bit about that. It's a republication from what, 1971 or something, you're saying?
Yes, Cycles, the Mysterious Forces That Trigger Events by Edward R. Dewey, the founder of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. And Patrick, you know the history, but most people don't. The foundation was established in 1941. So 83 years ago now. And it was founded by Edward Dewey. And at the time, he was the chief economist in the Hoover administration. And he was tasked by President Hoover with figuring out what caused the stock market crash and the Great Depression. And he talked to 100 economists and got 100 different answers and decided that maybe he had to look elsewhere for figuring this out. And eventually he got interested in cycles, in economic cycles, and then started to connect those cycles to wildlife cycles, astronomical cycles, geological cycles, predator-prey cycles, weather cycles, etc. And it was a very exciting time. He had tremendous interest from the academic world. The secretary of the Smithsonian was involved, the head of geophysics at Yale, the ambassador to Japan, etc. It was a really incredible effort to try to understand how cycles work in our world. And Dewey wrote this book in 1971. It was only in print once, and we just recently brought it back into print along with the work we've been doing to revive the Foundation for the Study of Cycles and help people be more aware of Dewey's work and it's the fact that it exists, and then move it forward and its relevance for today. I mean, if Dewey could see the computing and data processing power that we have today, he would be stunned. And one of the great joys of this, of kind of shepherding Dewey's work, is I get to go through the archives, Patrick, open up file cabinets and see these just meticulous, I wish I had one here with me, but just meticulous, pencil and paper documenting of prices and data over time, and then doing the hand calculations of figuring out cycles. Meanwhile, we can run millions of cycles analyses every day. We do run millions of cycles analyses every day with our current technology, and it's quite fun to see. But you really see that this was truly a labor of love for Dewey.
And it's really, really interesting what you say, because here is Dewey, who came along with quite literally lots of paper, pencils, pens, drew it all out, wrote stuff down. He had to put stuff into pocketbooks. I mean, I was in the New York Stock Exchange just a few weeks ago, and one of the things they brought out for the visit was they produced one of the early daily ledgers of the stock exchange, and it was quite fascinating, because apart from anything else, it was intriguing to read the first early daily ledgers of the stock exchange in the 1790s, because the first 10 things that they traded were all different kinds of fur that nowadays would have all manner of people on your back, and not on a fur perspective, but trying to have you banned for what you were trading in. But it's incredible, I mean, how he put together all of this data and came to his conclusion. So how did Dewey get into, his position of influence? Because he clearly had an important academic career before he got into the world of cycles.
Yeah, I don't know too much about how he ended up in the Hoover administration. I'm really much more familiar with his life, once he started to do his work on cycles, and eventually left and started the foundation in 1941. But he did have an incredible career. Obviously, he was the chief economist in the Hoover administration, and he was an economist, right? But he was an economist who began to see what I think a pattern we're seeing in a lot of professions these days, that it can take us, these kind of academic approaches can take us a certain distance, but there are other things that work in the world. Dewey subtitled his book, The Mysterious Forces That Trigger Events, right? So as a academic economist, exhausting that field, obviously he was at the pinnacle of his field, and then he decided that something's missing. And I think that's resonating with a lot of people today in a lot of fields, that we're trying to better understand our world in a more holistic way, a more, complete way. We understand that these kind of academic measurement data-driven approaches are one part of us understanding our world, but it's not the only part.
Well, it's very interesting, as you say, Richard, because we've got this fascinating view in the world at the moment where, of course, as everyone does in a contemporary age, we're the most intelligent, the most technological, the most brilliant. And therefore, it seems to me almost there's a degree of reluctance to look at cycles, because cycles would suggest that we haven't actually changed our behavior over time, that everything is just the same. Yet, I don't know, being an old-fashioned, dyed-in-the-wool trader, investor like you, it seems to me everything's a cycle, actually, because you look at how these things go, and ultimately, it may not be exactly the same thing repeating itself, but with a regular cadence, the same kinds of things turn round. And I'm not just talking about bell-bottom trousers.
Yes. I don't see how anybody could even speculate that cycles weren't a part of how our world works, right? I mean, if markets are consisting of the actions, collective actions of millions of human beings, I mean, we are the most cyclical creatures imaginable, right? The whole biosphere is full of cycles. We're full of cycles, diurnal cycles, breath cycles, hormonal cycles. You name it. We are cyclical creatures. We're comfortable with cycles. Cycles are just part of what we are. So our collective actions would obviously also consist of cycles as well.
And it's funny, isn't it? I mean, you look at cycles and you think back, well, all of those centuries ago, when Copernicus pointed out the fact that actually everything was cyclical relating to the sun and the moon, and actually who was revolving around whom. And suddenly the Roman Catholic Church had a hissy fit and really despised it. But at the same point in time, was actually using the data behind the scenes in order to set the dates, because that was the only way they could actually set the dates in their calendar for their holidays. And it's so interesting. And now in the modern world, it seems to me that, well, established religion has been thrown out the window, but yet still we've got this league of people who are reluctant to embrace cycles.
Yeah, and look, there's so many people talking about cycles today, right? It's in many ways, it's an exciting time for cycles. You have Ray Dalio, okay, Bridgewater Capital. I mean, one of the biggest hedge funds of all time. You have Neil Howe and his fourth turning work, Peter Turchin, you name it, right? There's a bunch of them. Howard Marks in finance, even Jim Simons, who just passed away, right? Considered the GOAT, the greatest of all time. He said, look, we don't really know why our predictions work. We just process a lot of data, see a lot of patterns, and that's how we make money. And so it is a little frustrating that Dewey's work isn't acknowledged. And it's a little frustrating that people like Dalio and others don't really talk about cycles, as a repetitive, predictable phenomena in our world, and try to connect it to even physical events. So why is that, not embraced today? I have a thesis about it, and I think it's because so much of our professional class, the authority and the power is coming from this idea that just a few people, know how things really work and have the knowledge and of cause and effect that the rest of us don't have. And they're so smart and intelligent that only a few people can really understand how it works. So, just trust us and we'll wield the power and control your destiny.
Yes, it's funny.
So I think that's just part of kind of our culture, our kind of this is all kind of a legacy of the guild based, economy that we have, whether it be in law or medicine or finance, et cetera, right? And I personally think it's really run its course. I think a lot of the angst that people are feeling today is connected to, like, what? A few great minds and a bunch of fast computers aren't the answer.
Well, it's very interesting because you also hit on a fascinating point, which is the linearity of thinking within professional movements. And you refer to guild culture, and actually that's a great description, because you have these unified entities of all of these people, and essentially what's hilarious is they all go through their own career cycle, but they seem to eschew cycles, which is, they work their way up, and then eventually they get that magnificent year where they're possibly head of the guild or head of the Medical Doctors Association, and then they retire and whatever, which is as great a cycle as anybody can possibly see. And yet there's a reluctance to embrace this whole cyclicity. And then what I find even funnier is everybody says, no, cycles don't exist. There's nothing like them. And then we have to, if you have a television or you're involved in any way in engaging with the media, you can't actually get past the news media for the discussion of the 4-year electoral cycle, which is definitely a man-made progression and undoubtedly has an impact on the economy as we go along.
Yeah, absolutely. So clearly the reluctance to embrace cycles isn't really about cycles. It's about something else. And Dewey addresses it in the beginning of his book. Cycles make us uncomfortable because they imply that we are not in control of our destiny, that there are some forces, that are at work that kind of reduce us to being puppets on a string.
Right.
Right. I happen to think that's kind of a ridiculous fear, right? I mean, we are definitely puppets on a string with regard to many things in our world, right? And we are less puppets on a string when we know what the forces are that we're interacting with, and we can better understand them, and we can learn to cooperate with them instead of try to run roughshod over them and pretend that they don't exist.
And isn't there a great argument? I mean, sorry to interrupt, but isn't there a great argument that part of the reason why cycles exist is actually because the human mind forgets stuff? I mean, you look at the long wave cycle of Kondratiev, which is really based upon the idea that people work about 40 years, and therefore somewhere between 40 to 60 years later, they've forgotten what it was that 2 generations ago did. So they do the same thing and screw it up. Ergo, one might argue, inflation recently across the world.
I think Neil Howe has done a great job with his generational cycles, right?
Right.
And in his recent book, The Fourth Turning is Here, he talks about this point exactly, that, cycles are rejected the most in the United States.
Right.
And the United States is the place where this 4-generation cycle, or 80 to 100 years, is playing out in the most extreme fashion. Right. So we are in this fourth turning right now. We're all at each other's throats. And we're the country that is, the most negative on cycles, period. So it's just very interesting. I do think when you try to deny cycles, they end up coming back and biting you.
It certainly seems that way. I mean, certainly inflation, I think, is an interesting one, because you and I, we were both born of an age where there was a considerable amount of inflation endemically in the system in the West, and I mean in the major Western economies. And then it all got killed, and it was killed off for 10, 15, 20 years, and it's like everybody forgot about it. And then suddenly it reappeared because somebody just forgot about it, and that would happen to co-align with the cycle quite elegantly.
Oh, there definitely is a 60 to 80 year cycle in interest rates.
Yep.
It should have bottomed in 2010 or so, but we had the Great Recession or financial crisis, whatever we call it. And I think that rates have been held artificially low, and I think that's partly why we're paying the price today. Because, there's a beach ball that's been pushed underneath, the surface of the water, that if we take our hands off the beach ball, it's going to explode up, right? And so we're trying to keep that beach ball from exploding up when it should have never been pushed under the surface of the water. Higher interest rates are not a bad thing. We have to have them through the cycles. We can't pretend that they don't exist, but we've gotten ourselves into this predicament, and this is what Dalio is talking a lot about with his big debt cycles. And, I appreciate what Dalio has, the analysis he put together, his approach to it, et cetera. I wish he would look a little deeper into some, historical cycles instead of just always giving it a behavioral explanation. But still, I think that's where we are. And I think that interest rate cycle, we're well within the up phase of it, where rates are going to be going higher for, a decade to 2 decades. And that should have started 10 years ago. And part of the reason we're in the fix we are today is because, again, we pretend like we don't have to go through that.
Well, and I think, though, that's also an important point about cycles, because one of the things people ascribe to them is an incredible mathematical precision. But the reality is that cycles are essentially a pattern within bands. They will exist over a certain period of time, but not precisely to the day. Can we say that the cycle that starts on, although I do notice there was January the 23rd is always the day when it rains, according to Dewey's fantastic book, when I was reading through that. But we can't say January 23rd is the start of a cycle, January 23rd is the end of a cycle, apart from perhaps if we're in calendar years, December 31st to December 31st. But there is an imprecision in cycles, but nonetheless they exist within a reasonable ratio.
Yeah, and I think, part of the challenge with cycles is it is very interesting to explore physical causes for cycles like sunspots, for example. Dewey talked extensively about an 11.11 year cycle in sunspots. The head of the Smithsonian at the time, Charles Greeley Abbott, who was part of the foundation at its beginnings, was a huge advocate of looking into these sunspot cycles and solar cycles in general and their influence on life on Earth. So, but when we do look at those, we can find compelling correlations, but we don't know the mechanism that would, actually drive the human behavior. Maybe we can figure that out. But whatever the case, human behavior is always interacting with the cycles, right? And we are kind of always predicting the future and responding, anticipating our predictions of the future, right? And we're anticipatory systems, feedback systems. So cycles do fluctuate. They come in and out of existence. I see it, we run millions of cycle analyses every day, and they're kind of like bubbles. You can see them coming in and out of existence. Some persist and are stronger, longer than others. But at a minimum, we look for physical causes if we can find them. But even if we find physical correlations, there's still the human behavior element that's, it's like in markets, Patrick, right? When something becomes known in markets, people adjust and it changes. Yep. So I think markets, that's partly why the cycles community spends so much time on markets, is such a rich environment for studying human behavior and the influence of cycles and the manifestation of cycles.
Absolutely. And there's so much data coming through that's readily available in how much you said. And it's fascinating because it strikes me that people are reluctant to acknowledge the concept of cycles, yet everybody wants to, in some way, shape, or form, diarize or organize their lives around what are effectively cycles. I mean, you look at the financial markets. At the moment, we're in the middle of quarterly reporting season, which, the clue is in the name there. Every 3 months, the good folks at the SEC demand that companies come along and report stuff. So why wouldn't there be some form of cycle that relates to stock market prices as a result of this, particularly because, let's face it, the indexes that are based behind it themselves, they rebalance at quarters, every 6 months, every year. So, I mean, there's clearly an argument for man-made cycles. But this is very interesting. You talk about, things like weather patterns and indeed the 11.1 year cycle of sunspots. I mean, this is one, I think, which a lot of people start going, whoa, we've suddenly stepped into voodoo. But there's an incredible amount of evidence of sunspots happen way up there, and then suddenly on Earth, weird, wacky, and wonderful things happen, not just amongst humanity, but also amongst all manner of physical events, earthquakes, and other tragedies taking place on Earth.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like, why is that an uncomfortable topic for us collectively? Why is it an uncomfortable topic that full moons result in more emergency room visits? So I don't know why that's such an uncomfortable topic for the media and for, our leaders, our academics.
I find that, that's particularly...
I put forward my thesis already about
absolutely.
why it is, but I find it baffling. It's like common sense to me. And if nobody else wants to know about it, okay, I'll use it myself.
Well, it's compelling, I think, also because every time you have a full moon, you can see how the animal kingdom is completely different. And certainly I know, because if I leave our dogs outside for the course of the evening, they're all baying at the moon in the middle of the night. And actually, you can hear the other stray dogs miles away doing the same thing. So there's clearly something happening that moves the feelings in animals. But of course, then I suppose the anti-cyclists will now say, you're reducing us all to mere hounds. How dare you? When we look at, when you look at that whole cyclical thing, though, you stepped on an interesting point. You talked about Ray Dalio, and Ray Dalio was, as you say, putting a very, very behavioral lens on what goes on. Whereas if you read the Dewey book, I mean, Dewey just basically points out all of these interesting cycles and how they either relate to other cycles or they relate to things that have happened in society. I mean, clearly there is some element of behavioral influence, but
I think the behavioral explanations are wonderful. I really do. I think it's a shame when you just reject the cycles that you can detect just by doing cycle-analysis, digital signal processing in the markets. One of them that I wrote about in the foreword to the book is the 41 to 42 month cycle in stock prices. Dewey documents it back to like 1850 in his book up through 1945 or so, and I walked it forward from 1945 to 2023. Right?
Yes.
So
yes.
It's still there. It's there today. We're in the up part of that cycle right now. That cycle is the reason that for 2 years, the foundation has been saying, no, the sky is not going to fall. We actually have a couple more years of upside, more than likely, based on, the 180 week or 42 month cycle. So that's been going on since 1860. Why people would not consider that as a factor in their decision making is beyond me, and why somebody like Dalio can't look at the data historically and say, hey, here's a cycle. Here's my behavioral pattern that I think explains these cycles. Let's work with these two together,
Yes. Yeah, no, find common ground between the two, because don't get me wrong as well, I'm with you. I think there's a lot to be said for behavioral discussions about how certain things happen. But there's also something very, very interesting going on, because clearly it can't be the same person behaving over a 160-year period.
And I think it just all goes back to the fact that we find this idea offensive, that something might be influencing our behaviors that we're currently unaware of. When I hear that, I want to know what it is. I don't want to put my head in the sand. I want to investigate it. I want to explore it. I want to come to a better understanding. And I want to ultimately, help us to learn to work with cycles more in harmony. I mean, what if the Federal Reserve had said, you know what, we're at, a 40-year low in interest rates. The cycles say that we're likely to have interest rates going higher for the next 20 plus years. Maybe we shouldn't try to hold the beach ball under the water right now. Maybe we should cooperate with the rising interest rate cycles, try to get ahead of it a little bit. Inflation isn't going to stay at 2% in a world where cycles are going up. The interest rate cycles are going up for the next 20 or 30 years. So that's something that I think we just have to factor into our decision making. And maybe they are, and they're just not telling us, But I think that we would be better off if we learn to recognize the cycles, respect the cycles, and cooperate with the cycles. Meanwhile, while everybody else is fighting them, those of us who do pay attention to them can actually use them to have an edge in the markets.
So you can have an edge in the markets by using cycles. Are there any other ways in which you find the deployment of cycles can be particularly useful?
Well, I do think that cycles in mental health is actually an interesting topic. You see a lot of interest today in sleep, right? And kind of getting more aligned with our biological cycles, right? And going to bed at a regular time, getting up at a regular time. I mean, this is everywhere, right? This
Absolutely.
is very basic cycle stuff. To me, it's a clear example that when we acknowledge the cycles and we work with the cycles, we get better outcomes. Our lives are better. We're more rested. We're more, less reactive, better health, etc. So to me, this interest in sleep and this effort that a lot of people are making to kind of align their routines with the natural physical biological cycles is a great illustrative example of how, if we can really understand cycles better, recognize them, identify them, and then learn to work with them instead of pretending that they don't exist and trying to run roughshod over them, which is, I think, what's gotten us into a lot of trouble today.
I certainly would agree with that. Well, let's take a brief pause. I'm going to give you a chance to have a drink of water or something to carry on into the next half of the show. We're here in the middle of Cycles, the Mysterious Forces That Trigger Events, talking with Dr. Richard Smith, the Doctor of Uncertainty, as he's known, the Chief Executive of the Centre for the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, I should say. And I suppose one of the things we've been talking about a lot is markets. And certainly when you look at markets, one of the things that's most important is the price of everything. That brings us to our book of the week this week, and it is The Price of Fish, a new approach to wicked economics and better decisions by Ian Harris and Michael Manelli. You may remember Professor Michael Manelli. He's a former guest on this show. He was at that point in time Sheriff of the City of London, and now he's in, well, there's another cycle for you, ladies and gentlemen. He is in the cycle as the 695th Lord Mayor of the City of London right now and doing a fantastic job. He was last seen, I think, at the Paris Olympics just a couple of days ago before heading up north in England to manage to visit a few factories, amongst other things, with various of, well, the guild companies, which were also being mentioned by Richard a few moments ago. Price of Fish, very, very interesting book, a fascinating conversation about markets, something completely different. And of course, where would we be, ladies and gentlemen, with markets at our core if it wasn't for those wondrous things, the exchanges? And it was my joy just a few weeks ago, well, as you caught our last show 2 weeks back, we had a fantastic opportunity to be inside the Ice House along with women on it. We were in the library of the New York Stock Exchange interviewing three dynamic, fantastic women at the heart of the New York Stock Exchange as it is. Before that, the week before, Friday the 5th of July, I had the honour of ringing the closing bell in honour of the 25th anniversary of my book, Capital Market Revolution. And indeed, here we have, ladies and gentlemen, a quick 1-minute video summarising that big day out, which resulted in a great moment of campanology for PLY. There we have it, ladies and gentlemen. Our marvellous moment with, including my wife, I think, invalidating the warranty on her Hermes scarf at the New York Stock Exchange. Fabulous event altogether. Really, really amazing experience and beautifully choreographed by the good folks of the New York Stock Exchange. Of course, an organization which has been going since 1792 when they signed that agreement under the buttonwood tree, which means they've seen a good many different cycles in the course of their history. Now, Richard, I mean, coming back to you, so we're here discussing with Dr. Richard Smith, Cycles, the Mysterious Forces That Trigger Events, based around, I mean, the book, which is just over your shoulder, and a magnificent cover, I have to say, the good folks of Harriman House have made as well. That's absolutely fabulous. Yeah, really, really wonderful. So, you know, Dewey, the author of the book, Edward Dewey, he had done all of this analysis. He put it into this magnum opus, which is superbly readable, I have to say. Lots of lovely quotations. It's good fun from start to finish. Are there any cycles in that book that you continue to look at today and they just sort of gassed your flabber, as it were? I mean, they surprise you, or you think, my goodness, it's still a shock to me that people are thinking that there's a cycle in there?
Well, we've already talked about one of them, which is the 42-month cycle in equity prices. But one of the ones I've been really focused on a lot lately are the sunspot cycles. You know, and because we're able to go down to a much more granular level today than Dewey was able to, looking at some of those geomagnetic cycles, the solar storms, the way they interact with our, our magnetosphere, and looking for some of the cycles that I'm seeing through our analytics, because we're able to do cycles analysis in real time today, and looking at, when we see a 4.5-day cycle, that is showing up in a lot of different assets. For example, can we connect that to, say, patterns of solar energy? So that area of sunspot and solar research was a very big one for Dewey and for others. I mentioned Charles Greeley Abbott, who was the secretary of the Smithsonian at the time. This was a big area of research for him. And that's something that we've been exploring, solar cycles and also climate cycles at the foundation more and more. So yeah, those are some big ones.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, again, sunspots are hard to miss at all points in time. And also, therefore, as a result of it, I mean, some of the climate cycles, which I appreciate may cause some people to have fits of the vapors at this point in time. But certainly, I mean, leaving aside what is global warming or whatever, it is very interesting that there are definitively cycles going.
Even if we do have global warming, there's still cycles within that global warming, right?
Yeah.
So whether you believe it or not, that doesn't really pertain to the question of, are there cycles in the climate that we should be aware of?
Yes.
One of the cycles I'd love to talk to you about a little bit, Patrick, is what's going on with exchanges today, because I do think that the kind of exploding interest in exchanges, the digital assets, cryptocurrencies, et cetera, this is part of the cycle. You could even call it Neil Howe's kind of fourth turning cycle right now. But exchanges are a increasingly important part of the infrastructure, of our economy today. And so I'm curious what you're seeing, if you connect that to any cycles yourself, and what are you seeing from the seat that you're sitting in?
Well, that's a really fascinating question, actually. And the thing I would say is, first of all, where we are at the moment, and something that a lot of people don't really want to talk about, is people talk about business models in e-commerce, and everybody jumps up and down. And you go to these startup conferences and so on, Richard. I'm sure you've been to more than a few of these sorts of events, and people, there's always somebody who gushes. It's really, really exciting. I mean, Airbnb, they don't own any hotel rooms. And I mean, Uber, they don't own any taxis. And Grubhub or whoever, these people, they don't own any restaurants. And you sit back and you look at them and you say, well, that's because they're exchanges. And actually, the thing that we're looking at here is that the exchange model is the epicenter of modern e-commerce. The technology has enabled that. And in some ways, if you want to look at that from a cyclical perspective, it's actually going all the way back to ancient Rome, ancient Greece, what they called the agora. And I mean, the agora was the original marketplace in ancient Greece. And in fact, the Egyptians had things like this beforehand. And it's fascinating because you would see in that there was the pricing in the market for absolutely everything. And these markets would happen depending on where you were. Daily, probably weekly, would be speciality in different things, sometimes monthly in different far-flung places. But Agora operated in the center of town. It was the epicenter of everything. It was not just your exchange. It was also actually your social media outlet, because everybody came along and they gossiped. And it was also, in fact, the epicenter of restauranting, food vending, et cetera, et cetera. So it was all like a good old-fashioned American country fair or something like that, with a marketplace at the center. And if we look at what's going on in the exchange business, what we're seeing at the moment is that technology is driving that thirst for data and the thirst for transparency in all markets, which is in itself, I think, an interesting long-term cycle, because the curiosity for me is that you talk about the people at the very top of government. It seems to me quite a lot of those people would rather like to control the price of everything. And actually, the one thing that surely we learned from 100 odd years ago on, when, say, particularly the Soviets and the communists took power, is that what even the good communists have realized in certain countries is you simply can't control the price of anything. You have to allow it to float. And again, you're talking about, taking that beach ball and submerging it under the water. Sooner or later, it's going to explode. And I think this is the upscale it's the upcycle for the exchange business. It has never been more exciting. I measure it by a pyramid, Young's pyramid of exchanges. And while everybody, the news media, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, the Financial Times, etc., all talking about the top end of the pyramid and all the mergers that have taken place there and all of these huge megacorps that are at $80 billion, like the Intercontinental Exchange that's leading the pyramid at the moment, the exciting bit is actually right down at the bottom, because what we're seeing is the bottom of the pyramid's getting broader and broader all the time, because a digital data-based world is enabling everything to be priced to some degree or another transparently, certainly a lot more transparently than before, where we just had to be the price taker of some monolith. And that's fascinating, because I think what it's also making is, first of all, it's growing a huge amount of data. Second of all, it's adding to our ability to study cycles. And third of all, I suspect we'll therefore be able to identify and nuance the cycles of prices of different markets. But most importantly for me is that the more data we seem to have, the more it actually demonstrates that the original work of Dewey, and in this sense, the man is absolutely blessed. I mean, what Mr. Dewey was able to do with a series of filing cabinets and endless supply of paper and pencils is incredible. I mean, absolutely boggling.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that insight, Patrick, that Uber, et cetera, is really an exchange. Yeah. And, you know, to me, this kind of explosion of exchanges, I love how you put it about you can't control price. And I do think that's part of what we're going through as a economy and as a society right now, is we're realizing that the old model of kind of top down, you know, control is just not cutting it anymore, you know, and that's part of the pain that we're going through, is transitioning away from that. You know, I mean, I know you're not in the US, but we've just had kind of a bit of a crisis here over the past month with our two, you know, octogenarian presidential candidates. I mean, talk about just, you know, the end of an era, right? That is not sustainable anymore. And so it's exciting, all these new technologies, to see, can we kind of move that locus of decision-making responsibility, informed decision-making responsibility, right, down to a more granular level. I think it's, you know, it's not like we need to abandon the top down. I think we need both top down and bottom up. How do we ultimately have informed decision-making authority happening, you know, at a more widespread local level, while also still, you know, having the important inputs from the top?
Yeah, and I mean, that empowerment of people makes a huge difference. And certainly, I always thought it's very interesting, the different ways. I mean, people say, you know, how did the United States of America become the incredible success it was throughout the 20th century? The first answer is, of course, have an incredibly successful end to the 19th century, which builds you so much momentum that you can't really go wrong. But the main point is, you look at thought and ideas. And clearly, as we were at, you know, 1920, I mean, the Hoover administration was very, very much being defined by what was going on the other side of the Atlantic, and indeed, in essence, on the other side of the Pacific, at the opposite end of the United States of America, because Russia, the rise of communism, was defining a huge amount of thought. And I think it's so interesting that, you know, Nikolai Kondratiev came up with a huge amount of really, really fascinating work on long-term economic cycles, which I think he would have honed to something truly incredible. He took that to the Communist Party, and they said, no, we control everything. We know how everything's done. So therefore, we're going to throw you into a gulag and ultimately kill you. Right. Whereas you've
literally got killed for cycles.
Literally got killed for cycles. I mean, the cycle martyr.
I hope that doesn't happen to me.
No, well, I certainly, well, I think at the moment, you know, depending on what happens in the US presidential election, I still think you're probably okay. But okay. It's fascinating. You know, the USA, on the other hand, you've got President Hoover is kind of like, yeah, bring Dewey in. Okay, talk to me about some of this stuff again. I want to know why the Great Crash and the Great Depression took place. You think it's to do with cycles? That's interesting. Go research it. Go think about it. And that openness of thinking is the thing that I find is quite fascinating, because at the moment, it seems to me we're getting a top-down lid being put on it, but actually the price of everything is blowing the world up at the same point, because everybody can trade what they want effectively over the internet, whether the government lets them or not.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in how can that happen but that it can be really good price discovery, right? A lot of I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, but a lot of the activity in the crypto coins, especially cryptocurrencies, altcoins, et cetera, so much of it just seems like not really good price discovery. So
Yeah.
how can we kind of, spread it out, but still have it be high quality price discovery? Do you see any of that going on yourself?
Well, you see, I think there's a very interesting issue here, because I find it quite amusing that, look, when Dewey was writing his book, we were reaching the early stages of what I would call of stage one of fiat currency pessimism. And actually, isn't it interesting? The one thing that we share as a cycle throughout our careers, and in fact, from pretty much from preschool on, is the fact that somebody was always cynical about the fact that the US dollar had peaked. And here we are 40 years later, and it's still, the conversation is the US dollar has peaked. And I find it fascinating because, in one sense, what crypto came along to deliver was a better alternative in a kind of libertarian vein that would be a better store of value, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, actually, I mean, I end up being the kind of Don Cupid of crypto. I mean, I talked about digital assets and capital market revolution in 1999, yet I find myself very cynical about a lot of what's going on today, particularly, I have to say, Bitcoin, because the good thing about gold is you can melt it down. It has industrial applications. It has applications as a beauty product. And there's all sorts of ways that it can be used, and it's an element. Whereas the artificial nature of Bitcoin just happening to be some pixels that people think are more sexy than other pixels, I'm not really buying into. I mean, that's one where I think we've definitely taken the mysterious forces a little bit too far in terms of those events that are being triggered.
I don't think we should put that on Dewey.
Yeah, well, possibly. No, I don't think that's remotely fair. I mean, but what you're seeing with that, though, I would say, is that seems to me to be like a classic panic cycle, such as, say, Kindleberger would also have written about later. I mean, there's very much a huge behavioral thing, it strikes me, in behind the top tier of crypto, because a lot of people are treating that as, it's almost become a kind of religious cult that you have to believe in every element of the crypto in order to move forward. Whereas I think a lot of what we're looking at is, ultimately, can you have better provenance by using a blockchain? Yes, that can be very, very useful. Can you have a digital asset that's very readily tradable, that therefore, because it's instantly tradable, becomes essentially money? Yes, I think you can. But then on the other hand, that's just taking us back to barter in a way, because it's effectively making frictionless barter. And then you look at distributed ledgers and you say, well, that's a cycle too. I mean, 1066, they had tally sticks, which is where you broke a stick in half. And therefore, when you came back to make your declarations to the taxman, he had the other half of your tally stick. And if it measured up, you were allowed to carry on and go about your business.
Let me ask you this. I mean, I do think that one of the interesting ideas to me about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin in particular is this idea of, digital assets that we as individuals can have more control over our own data, over our own life online, basically, right? Right now, all our data is captured by others who use it to then engage in behavior modification of us, right?
Yep.
And what we see and hear. And so I think about it from a finance trader perspective. Is there a way that I can, I guess, better engage with markets as an individual in a way that's more autonomous for me, in a way that, and we've talked about this probably on the last show when we were talking about payment for order flow, right?
Yep.
How that works, and how Citadel and Susquehanna and others are buying all of this order flow so that they can get a better picture of the markets, right? So is there a place, are you seeing anything in the exchange world of kind of a digital assets around order flow or something like that, where the individual can actually, get some benefit from the data that they generate instead of giving it all up to the centralized card holders?
Well, it certainly seems to me, I mean, this is very interesting, because you were talking a lot in the last show when we were together, which I think was good grief. And I'm trying to remember, I think that was show number 21. So it was quite a while ago, ladies and gentlemen. the point you were making there was like data autonomy and sovereignty of the individual. Now you're adding an extra interesting layer to it as well, which is this whole issue of, I mean, what is my data worth, and essentially where am I? And I think we've certainly gone,
which has been, elevated by this new technology that we've all been hit with in the past 18 months, which are the transformer models, the LLMs, right?
Yep.
And can we, who are actually generating the semantic content, leverage that, one, to help others better understand our own ideas, right? People want to know what I'm thinking, what's going on with cycles, et cetera. Can I package that into some kind of LLM? Or can the Foundation for the Study of Cycles kind of package its signals as a digital asset and have a digital asset exchange around that? If it helps people get better outcomes, then, the generator of those signals is rewarded.
Look, I think absolutely anything that can be packed into a structure that can be an asset has got value. And it's therefore something that can be traded as a transfer of that asset for some degree of risk transfer, because there's inherent value in that unit for whether it's speculation or productive benefit of what goes on. That's very, very key. And I think you hit on a very, very interesting point in relation to the whole area of personal data, because also we're just generating so much of it. I mean, essentially, the people who were born, well, what was it? I mean, in 2000 AD, effectively, the humanity created more data in that 1 year than they'd created in all of human history so far. It might have been 1999 or 1998, but it's right about. And then the next year, they created more data than all of human history so far, which was essentially all of human history plus the previous year. So it was more or less double what had been produced. And if you think about where we are, I mean, actually, I talked about this in Victory or Death, my book, which was all about effectively where we are in the cycle of who people are. And we're now into, the gigabyte girls were pretty much about a generation ago. We're now into well beyond petabyte people, which is just a string of data with so many noughts on the end of it that ultimately something in there is of value to somebody. The trick is mining it, of course, to find out what goes on. And I think, therefore, it is quite interesting that we talk about data mining, because it is truly like trying to find the mother lode in the middle of some Tanzanian mountain somewhere in order to find, some great diamond that back in the day you would have taken to Queen Victoria or something. It's fascinating. And I think the opportunity for traded markets is simply infinite. As long as you can create something which is an asset, which is preferably sitting on a Venn diagram, where on one end there's the producer, on the other end there's a user, and in the middle is a group of people who, for whatever reason, may wish to have part of it, hold that data, in some way, shape, or form, repackage that data elsewhere, then you have got another opportunity. I mean, if we look at the world of indexes. I mean, sometimes it looks completely insane from the outside. I mean, the Icelandic Stock Exchange, I think, lists something like 100 and something bonds, but manages to have something like 40 different indexes for those bonds, which seems quite counterintuitive. But the truth is, there are so many different opportunities for payoff, you can manage to create that. And if you look at the way that our markets are all the better for, I would contend, the multiplicity of ETFs, exchange-traded funds that have come along, yet they themselves are their own trading, living life form organisms going through their particular cycle. And then you've got all of these other products that are still being born. So the answer is, can you in some way, shape, or form put together cyclical study data and create some methodology by which it could be sold on exchange? Oh yes, I firmly believe that. And I think the other thing that's interesting is there's only going to be a greater number of potentials for you to discern cycles, as you're already saying, as you go along, particularly as we get to understand more about what's going on in the likes of outer space and so on. Because let's face it, coming soon, we're going to see a series of space exchanges.
Yep. Space weather is a very interesting topic as well.
Fascinating. Well, there's two things. I mean, space weather is very interesting. And here I'm sitting in the middle of the Caribbean, and somewhere 400 miles away or 500 miles away, there is a 50 to 60% chance of a wind running into a lovely piece of warm air, which is going to create something that's not going to be so lovely, but it'll look quite spectacular as it whizzes by. And that's, when you think about all of this sort of data, it's just incredible how much information we can manage to find and how many more cycles there are. But then I'm doing your job now by telling you how wonderful cycles are. So let me ask you a question, Richard, because actually I think originally you were so early in our canon that we didn't ask you this question the first time around. I'm not quite sure. I wrote about Capital Market Revolution, 1999, 25th anniversary, celebrated nicely just recently, as you saw. You're here, President's Foundation of the Study of Cycles. You've just written a fabulous foreword to this magnificent book, which I'm personally shocked that it took a 50-year cycle to see it reprinted, because it's such a fascinating read. Richard, where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
Well, very interesting question, Patrick. I'm personally fascinated by the new AI technologies. And I think that, while people talk about, I know I'm going to open up a can of worms here, but this idea of AGI, right? Artificial general intelligence. I don't believe that is actually going to happen. I think that what we're going to learn from AI is what's uniquely special about human intelligence. And that just like computers did, just like smartphones did, this new AI, this new model, it's a type of computing, right? It's like natural language computing. And I think that it is going to continue, like the former technologies have done, to open up new opportunities for higher order value creation by human beings. So what I'm particularly excited about is how machines and people learn to work together more, how we really integrate this new technology, and how we can leverage this new technology to help us, maybe this is part of what we were talking about earlier, to kind of, get the decision-making authority more spread out to, to a lower level of the pyramid, but in an effective way. You get on Twitter and you look at all the nonsense that's being spewed. It's not what we need. We need some balance between expertise and grassroots decision making. So that's what I'm excited about. And I think that could be the future of exchanges. If ultimately we can create local marketplaces with good price discovery, and we can facilitate more exchange at a more local level between communities and people, and we could leverage that, through some of these new technologies, AI and blockchain, that is something I could get really excited about.
Gosh, 1 minute, that's a bit of a design for living. It's fantastic, Richard, altogether. I really love that. That's an absolutely superb description of what's going on. So I think also the point about AGI, really, really interesting amongst many other pointers, and I think how that interacts with what's going on. I'm always reminded of a friend of mine who's a computing guru. He always says, look, the problem with artificial intelligence and all these things are it's very, very easy for us to manage to recall the point at which anybody can manage to remember what's going on in relation to our recollection of our grandmother's house. Any AI can remember that for us, this, that, and the other. But why can an artificial intelligence model not remember the smell of my granny's shampoo when I get in the shower? Yeah. And it's true. I mean, that's absolutely true. That's every 6 or 7 year old kid who went and spent the weekend with their grandparents. They can remember that. And somehow or other, artificial intelligence doesn't really get there. And I'm very sorry. I missed out on Anne Berg's question. I was not aware of it. I'm so sorry, Anne. Great stuff, Anne said. And I think we answered the question ultimately, because are you also looking at cycles outside the US, e.g. currency depreciation and high interest rates in emerging markets over the past decade? I think the answer to that would be definitely a definitive yes, Richard.
Oh, we look at anything that we can get prices on. So absolutely. We look at currencies. I don't have a lot of access to emerging market debt at the moment, but I'm sure if we can get the data, we can do a cycles analysis on it. Absolutely. And I think it would be very interesting.
And thank you very much for your question. My profuse apologies for missing that on the way through. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Richard Smith. You may be the doctor of uncertainty, but you're definitely the doctor of fascination when it comes to cycles. I hope your book, your reprinted new edition of The Mysterious Forces That Trigger Events, Cycles by the wonderful Dewey, has huge success. We will be back, ladies and gentlemen, in September. I just have time to say a huge thank you to our magnificent production team today. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Mary. My name is Patrick L. Young, and if you're looking for a market to be built over the course of summer, send me an email. I wish you all a great summer and a great week in life and markets. Thanks for watching.